We're missing an awful lot of other things that were going on too, whether who owns the Holocaust, whether it's the genocide of the European Jews, or whether it includes the death of political prisoners, homosexuals, Sinti and Roma, and others. All of these are definitional complexities which entail different time frames and different geographical or systemic scales. So all of this is by way of saying that we need to avoid too much reliance on reified concepts and constructs. And so this, just to bring home the so-called, what I take from the complexification offered by the notion of transcultural memory, also transtemporal memory, many different memory frameworks, is the need for a new vocabulary that avoids the standard reifications. It's sort of odd that I've made most of my career on the concept of collective memory, and I think it's a really lousy concept. And so what I prefer is a whole bunch, a different vocabulary which tries to processualize and complexify what it is we're talking about. So in my own work, I talk about mnemonic, and mnemonic is a tough word, and this awful experience in my book, The Politics of Regret, is I hired an the press hired an indexer who, for some reason, indexes the word mnemonic as if it's got something to do with lungs or has a U in it that it doesn't. And it's like, we paid $1,500 for this index. The word you index most frequently doesn't actually appear anywhere in the book, but that's a different issue. Mnemonic agents and carriers participate in mnemonic processes and practices. There's a wide diversity in them to produce mnemonic products and mnemonic fields that are constituted as dynamic systems. What this avoids is the reification memory, or the worst reification, collective memory. But I should also point out that as a sociologist, I take a fairly iconoclastic view that individual memory is itself an ideological construct. So when we're talking about memory, we're talking about these complex flows and relationships, both temporally and spatially. And one of the things I've done in my work is to make lots of enemies of psychologists, because I think they're the ones who should have to use the special adjective individual, because I think the individual memory is the special problem. Okay. I think that all memory is social or collective or shared. And this is perhaps part of the motivation for my question that I asked of the first speaker. Is there really a distinction between the emotion and the expression of the emotion when I smile at a baby and the baby smiles back and we all feel good until it throws up on your shoulder? This is actually part of what, or when I am embarrassed and I blush, is the embarrassment separate from the physiological manifestation that we call embarrassment, namely the blushing? The same thing I would say is true of memory. There are certain private acts of recall, that is, I can test whether you remember a sequence of numbers. Of course, what we're assuming at the foundation is that you come from a numerate society and you've grown up with numbers that are more complex than 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100, or there are cultures that don't necessarily specify grammatically more than 3, a few, several, or a few. And so the view of memory regions and memory systems I'm advancing is one that makes the ontological point that any of these memory problems we're talking about, I think, are damaged when we're reducing it to acts of recall rather than to acts of expression or to qualities of individuals. Some of you may know, been arguing for many years that there's a difference between what I would call collected memory and collective memories, and that the memories that every individual has of a particular event or a particular idea is not simply aggregated. It's not simply an aggregation process, but there's a collective process. So, in fact, I would argue that the process of social expression and transmission and talking about is at least analytically recognize that it's analytically distinct. The question is whether it's ontologically distinct. from the individual or originary experience. I think we need to use the concept of memory in a sensitizing way that I've talked about, referring to varieties of mnemonic practices and products that are mutually embedded. What this allows us to do is it allows us to see, not to say this is the real memory, the core of the Matryoshka doll, but that all of these are part of the discourse. What that's given us is, again, the exceptional value of the third wave of memory studies, is it's helped us understand whichever term that we want to take, whichever term makes for the good title of a book or the name of a conference. I think that these are all absolutely essential developments, returning to Astrid's 2011 Parallax paper, whether we refer to memory as embedded, as traveling, as multidirectional, or as entangled. I think what this does is explodes our lay understanding of memory, that when we talk about memory, we know what we're talking about, and that it's this and not that, and that the individual memory or the ability to remember your phone number or your address is real memory, and Schindler's List is not. That's something else, that's representation. For movies, if we have this more complex notion, and we remember that whatever we're talking about, whether it's the most macro, whether it's the most long-term, or the most micro, or the most short-term, is embedded, travels, is multidirectional, and is entangled. So this is the view of memory studies, and the true benefit, I think, of the third wave that Astrid lays out so clear, and in her work on transcultural memory lays out so clearly. Thanks.
Could you leave it on?
Sure.
Yeah. You can get back to your the slide we have already up.
So,
There's the one with the national and the individual. This one, that's fine, great, thanks. Yeah, yeah. So thanks, Jeff, for this great survey, which manages to convince us, on the one hand, that you are the man of the complexity, and on the other hand, the guy who in the end nevertheless reduces it to a single slide and says, this is it. So I think you managed to get the best of both worlds. So there's so much, I think, that you've offered us that it's sort of hard to, again, sum it up, especially since I tend to be one of the, somebody who gravitates towards the complexity rather than to the simplifying. What I really appreciated in your presentation is your engagement with this idea of a third move in memory studies, and it's been called global memory, transcultural memory, transnational memory, traveling memory. I think this is a stage where we're trying to grapple with, and it's also behind, of course, this COST project in search of transcultural memory in Europe. And what I think is one of the most important things that you brought out is the notion of that that doesn't mean that we're dealing with a seamless world, a sort of a one world where everything becomes the same, but rather that this is perhaps what's more important than thinking about the extension of the frame of reference is to think about this complexity of the different frameworks, and as you're suggesting that there's different types of scales at which memory and memory production, communication operates, and that there is no hierarchy of scales, but rather that there are different ways in which the individual and the global can be linked, thinking of work by Posner on this, from the intimate to the global, and that we have also different types of interconnectedness among these different levels. And in relation to that, you point out how this idea of different scales, multiscalarity, could also be transposed to the temporal dimension, and you link this to the idea of the region. So going along that, I say yes, 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 yes. It comes to the region, then I think, yes, well, doesn't that the region, what makes the region so fascinating, and in many ways you could see Europe is a region. If you think about provincializing Europe, it's a region. The region suggests the idea of a boundary, whereas the idea of a world or the planet or the global, which is an alternative term, is somehow undefined, and it's got no limits to it. And the interesting thing about the region as a sort of a mesostructure between the global and the local is that it has to have some sort of a boundary. By definition, it's not the whole world, because otherwise it wouldn't be called a region. And so what then I'm wondering about is if what we shouldn't add to your model to add another level of complexity is the question of the articulation between these different levels and how does one move from one level to the other. And the question of boundaries. Where does this flow, what we talk about, what Astrid Earle talks about in her travelling memory, it suggests a model of flow. But if we talk about the idea of boundary, we have the question of, at certain points there's blockage, there's thresholds, there's things which don't go through, there's points of zones of translation zones where things are, where things don't manage to move on. And I think that's a point that we would then have to add into the model, these points of articulation, of connectedness or non-connection. Also then you could think of that in terms of the lateral, or sort of the horizontal connection, but also laterally, how does one region relate to another region? And when does one region change its contours? And I think this needs to be added into this point of discussion. And what is it that changes the boundaries or the configurations of these different frameworks? And that seems to me, in a sense, the next point that we have to think about is not so much how many frames there are, but is it possible for them to connect, to articulate, and what are the things that make them change? Because otherwise we just recreate this notion of these bubbles of sort of memory communities which then can exist autonomously but somehow are not in the world, which I take to be the challenge of the transnational turn in memory studies. And here I realise that I'm at heart a cultural memory studies person, and for that reason also involved in the mediation part of our COS project. Because what comes to mind, of course, when you look at this set of issues from the question of mediation is sort of what mediates between these levels, what mediates between, at a horizontal level, between regions, between persons, between families. And I think this is where we come back to the question of communication, the question of talking, but more so the question of media and stories, which actually are the things which can travel most easily. And this would perhaps link us back to the discussion earlier this morning about the question of networks. It seems to be more interesting to not so much ask the question, how do our networks extend them, but when do you actually find, as it were, a weak link in your network to get into another network, or where do you actually make a leap into another network? And I think this is where it's interesting to think about the role of the arts and of the media in not so much the news media, but the media that were referenced this morning, for example, in international movies, what sort of role they play in this point, in the articulation of different memory groups, and at the horizontal level, but also in the vertical level. If I'm thinking, you mentioned in your regions of memory, you mentioned, for example, the stolen generations in Australia. Clearly, the hot topic in Australia. How do I know about the stolen generations in Australia? In the first instance, through Sally Morton's book, My Place, which was one of the catalysts of the discussion in Australia, but it certainly has been one of the points of reference for people outside Australia. The same with the disappeared in Argentina and other places in South America. Movies like La Historia Oficial and the one we talked about in dinner yesterday, I've forgotten the name of it, the Polanski one of the Death of the Maiden. These again are ways in which stories from elsewhere are being, as it were, parachuted into places elsewhere, and appealing, you could say, not to persons necessarily as citizens of a nation, but in the first instance as individual viewers with emotions, right? So I think this would be something that we could add into this discussion, to think about those ways in which it's possible to change identity, to expand your identity, to create links which may be person to person, and again we can come back to this question of the rethinking the hierarchy of skill, person to person, local to local, rather than going through, as you quite rightly point out, this Matryoshka system. I think I'll leave it there, because I'm sure there's many other questions that you want to raise, and I'm not sure who's chairing it. Do you want? Okay? Fine. Thank you. Maybe I ask you to respond to this first, or stand here anyway, or come up here so people can talk to you.
I'm not sure I have a response other than yes, we agree. The reason is that I've learned a lot from your work, so yeah. I mean, if there's something in particular you want me to respond to.
This notion of changing, you know, how does the notion change in the aerodynamics that you actually
Okay,
change your
all
identity?
right, so yes.
Because a lot of it say we
Right.
are still part of the same identity.
Yes, so, you know, I don't join intellectual cults, and so I sometimes try to avoid the work of Nicholas Muman because you have to take on a whole new vocabulary. But I like his notion of autopoietic or self-forming systems that are continually in process, because I think it gets at the temporal dimension in the way that some of our reified concepts or constructs don't. And so one of the interesting things about any region of memory is not only, for instance, if you take the Northeast Asian region of memory, that, you know, if China and Japan are threatening each other in the South China Sea, or something like that, and the rest of the world gets upset and says, you know, you people have to work it out, and Japan has to apologize for Nanjing and not take it back 2 years later, as they continually do with Korea. If there's outside pressure, that's the global impacting the regional. By the same token, then the Prime Minister of Japan has to quell his domestic opposition groups, saying, how could you have given in? But you know, and so what we've got is a continual process of formation and reformation. Also, the notion of how a region is constructed changes not only from the analytical perspective, but from the point of view of the participants. So, you know, in post-war German history, you can trace out there were those who who said that we're not going to have diplomatic relations, or when Brandt was criticized a great deal for even setting foot on East German soil, and then, you know, after he did that, it was considered perfectly normal for there to be these diplomatic relations. So the way in which the region is constructed is continually reconstructed. It's always a work in process. So that's why I like the notion of autopoietic system, in which there's any freeze frame of the process and any map that's big. So one of the problems with network sociology is that network sociology is very poor at dealing with change, that you could draw a network diagram at time 1, another one at time 2, and another one at time 3, and what you can say is it changed, but you can't, it's one thing changed into another thing, when in fact it never was a thing, because the minute you pressed stop or clicked the camera, it already didn't exist. So yeah, I like this, I agree with the emphasis on continual change and reconfiguration, and anything that is a region is no longer a region the minute you described it as a region.
Questions there?
Over here,
Sorry.
Professor Günther.
Yeah, I would like to ask Jaska actually a little bit about universal. You mentioned this global universal, and but you know that, for example, the philosophy in the Hegelian sense, Allgemeinheit, it means universal, could be translated but a little bit differently, because it presupposes some knowledge about holiness, or about some gestalt. For example, if you would like, how could you remember the novel of Lev Tolstoy, War and Peace, if you don't understand all these texts as some universal? You know, it means it presupposes some kind, according to Hegel, it presupposes some kind of job of your spirit. You know, you need to do a lot before experience of this one universal which exists in all moments, like in novel of Tolstoy. It means that universal doesn't have spatial connotations in this sense. Universal presupposes some kind of abstract and particular work of your spirit in order to accept this universal. And in your sense, I look that you use this concept universal completely differently, that in some global sense. Could you explain, or do you see possibility to use universal in another sense, like I mentioned in this one, dialectical?
So, two responses. One is that I'm not a big fan of the concept of global memory, because I don't, despite Donnie Levy was my student and a very close friend, I don't think he's entirely right. I don't think, I guess the Holocaust is a cosmopolitan memory, but I don't think it's necessarily a global memory. There are plenty of people who don't know, don't care, and so maybe this is sort of an ideal extreme of a continuum that never actually exists. Whether we're talking, we can talk about a long enough time scale so that we're talking about, if we're talking about humanity, we're talking about a common descent, biological or natural history, the gene pool from Australopithecus to Homo sapiens or whatever. I don't think that's particularly useful from the perspective of memory studies with one qualification, not particularly from the perspective of memory studies because, you know, I live in a southern US state where probably 80% of the population doesn't believe in evolution and thinks the world was created 10,000 years ago in one bolt of lightning. So whether we can speak about a universal memory of the species memory, for dialectics, I'll go with Marx. Is there a species memory there? You know, empirically there's not. Although I actually am compelled by Freud's analysis. I know it's very unfashionable, but I like totem and taboo. I like Moses and monotheism. The notion, you know, all right, do I think that there were two Moseses and the second one was the hidden, repressed memory of the patricide of the first one? No, I mean, no. But do I believe there is something fundamental about the passage of generations and the tension between, let's say, fathers and sons? There's something universal in the human spirit about our senescence, our mortality, and the diminution of strength over time and passing that Freud describes in a very idiosyncratic way. I do think there's something generally universal about that kind of a psychological process, even if it manifests very differently. As for Hegelian absolute spirit and the like, I guess I would say that's above my pay level. I'm not a theologian.
We have a couple of questions here and then over there. So, Steffi?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your lecture. I enjoyed it very much and I would agree emphatically on most of your points since I've been thinking about acts and practices of memory instead of kinds of memory, and thus I was very content with that. There's one short question left. When you said, when you talked about the potential contributions of memory studies concerning the ontological level, you said that we could qualify individual memory as an ideological construct. And that's my question, do you really need that? It sounds to my ears quite universal to talk about individual memory in any case as an individual construct, because it might be reification of concepts again. Why not talk about individual memory in circumstances and cases and practices as something that isn't problematic at all? Of course, sometimes it might be an ideological construct, but not the concept on the whole, the concept of individual memory.
So, one of the things I'm doing is I'm arguing against or taking a futile stand against the hegemony both of psychology among the disciplines, but also as an American against the fetishization of rampant individualism.
Yeah.
As a sociologist, I read my Durkheim very early on and learned that individualism is, is a product of a certain level of social differentiation, or in my more radical college days reading Althusser, that ideology hails the what's the right quote, ideology hails the individual,
Interpolate.
the subject as an individual, the individual as a subject,
Yeah.
right? That this notion of our individuality is ideologically and socially constructed. And I just think that the other way I come at it when I argue with psychologists is there's a classic paper, I think it was by Endel Tulving, where he talks about there being 24 different kinds of memory, and then sort of half as a joke, Rudiger writes one where he says, actually it's not 24, it's 256. And so what I argue is that the psychologists who claim that they're talking about real memory, even they don't agree on what we're talking about, episodic memory, semantic memory, and 254 other, I mean, that's obviously an exaggeration, but there are many, many, many different kinds of processes. And they're not, I mean, the neuroscientists have shown that the actual physiological processes involved in, recognizing a smell and knowing that Barack Obama is the president are radically different at the neurological level, and they're certainly different at the cultural level. So I do think it's problematic to talk about individual memory. I always say two things about that. One is that even when you're doing it alone in bed at night with your eyes closed and going over what happened today, you're doing it as a social person with a social identity. The demonstration example I give in my undergraduate classes is I ask people to close their eyes and think about their maternal grandmother. And then I say that you can do that, and I can't see the picture in your head, but you wouldn't have done that if I didn't ask you to do that, and that actually is a better model of the way memory works. So the idea that the memory is yours and solely yours, I don't believe in it.
Yeah. I'm completely d'accord, but why skip it as a level of analysis? Sorry.
It gets its own discipline, it gets all the grant money, so I think they're doing okay. It gets the entire consumer culture of the West, so individualism will survive without me.
I would like to you to elaborate more on the comment on Anne, this about boundaries. You said, of course, about this flowing and continuous process of changing boundaries. But if we proceed with Anne's question about crossing the boundaries, just like, for example, this example of stolen generation, what actually is transgressing these boundaries when such a book or a movie is going across cultural borders? Can we speak about really memory travels? Because the reception of it, it's another problem. What is transformed in this, what is transmitted in this process?
Yeah, so I agree with Anne entirely that boundaries are fascinating, but boundaries are not solid. Even this is a boundary, the atoms are moving at a level we can't see. Boundaries are the product of the work that we do within them and require us to maintain them. And I actually think that's a great site for memory studies, is looking at boundary transgressions, boundary cross. This is what the entire project of Traveling Memories, looking at the way memory crosses boundaries, and in fact then ends up reconstituting those boundaries in new ways as a result. So when Turkish immigrants to Germany start, quote unquote, remembering the Holocaust or remembering German history, when every American, even if their grandparents came in 1910, celebrate President's Day or the 4th of July, and adopt a certain kind of identity. There are also instances of what we don't adopt. So everybody is proud to be an American and proud that we won World War II and did the right thing, and we forget a lot in that process. But if somebody talks about reparations for slavery, the instant response, well, my grandfather came in 1920, it's not my problem. There are very interesting ways in which boundaries are constructed. The generational issue, Günter Grass died last week. He's absolutely fascinating.